triumph aroused the greatest jubilation throughout the English working class, and brought the Union a mass of new members. Meanwhile the strike in the north was proceeding. Not a hand stirred, and Newcastle, the chief coal port, was so stripped of its commodity that coal had to be brought from the Scotch coast, in spite of the proverb. At first, while the Union's funds held out, all went well, but towards summer the struggle became much more painful for the miners. The greatest want prevailed among them. They had no money, for the contributions of the workers of all branches of industry in England availed little among the vast number of strikers, who were forced to borrow from the small shopkeepers at a heavy loss. The whole press, with the single exception of the few proletarian journals, was against them. The bourgeois, even the few among them who might have had enough sense of justice to support the miners, learnt from the corrupt liberal and conservative sheets only lies about them. A deputation of 12 miners who went to London received a sum from the proletariat there, but this too availed little among the mass who needed support. Yet, in spite of all this, the miners remained steadfast, and what is even more significant, were quiet and peaceable in the face of all the hostilities and provocation of the mine owners and their faithful servants. No act of revenge was carried out, not a renegade was maltreated, not one single theft committed. Thus the strike had continued well on towards 4 months, and the mine owners still had no prospect of getting the upper hand. One way was, however, still open to them. They remembered the cottage system. It occurred to them that the houses of the rebellious spirits were their property. In July, notice to quit was served the workers, and, in a week, the whole 40,000 were put out of doors. This measure was carried out with revolting cruelty. The sick, the feeble, old men and little children, even women in childbirth, were mercilessly turned from their beds and cast into the roadside ditches. One agent dragged by the hair from her bed, and into the street, a woman in the pangs of childbirth. Soldiers and police in crowds were present, ready to fire at the first symptom of resistance, on the slightest hint of the justices of the peace, who had brought about the whole brutal procedure. This too, the working men endured without resistance. The hope had been that the men would use violence. They were spurred on with all force to infringements of the laws, to furnish an excuse for making an end of the strike by the intervention of the military. The homeless miners, remembering the warnings of their Attorney General, remained unmoved, set up their household goods upon the moors or the harvested fields, and held out. Some, who had no other place, encamped on the roadsides and in niches, others upon land belonging to other people, whereupon they were prosecuted, and, having caused damage of the value of a halfpenny, were fined £1, and, being unable to pay it, worked it out on the treadmill. Thus they lived 8 weeks, and more of the wet fag end of last summer under the open sky with their families, with no further shelter for themselves, and their little ones than the calico curtains of their beds, with no other help than the scanty allowances of their union and the fast shrinking credit with the small dealers. Hereupon Lord Londonderry, who owns considerable mines in Durham, threatened the small tradesmen in his town of Seaham with his most high displeasure, if they should continue to give credit to his rebellious workers. This noble lord made himself the first clown of the turnout in consequence of the ridiculous pompous ungrammatical ukases addressed to the workers, which he published from time to time, with no other result than the merriment of the nation. When none of their efforts produced any effect, the mine owners imported, at great expense, hands from Ireland and such remote parts of Wales as have as yet no labour movement. And when the competition of workers against workers was thus restored, the strength of the strikers collapsed. The mine owners obliged them to renounce the union, abandon Roberts, and accept the conditions laid down by the employers. Thus ended at the close of September the great 5 months battle of the coal miners against the mine owners, a battle fought on the part of the oppressed with an endurance, courage, intelligence, and coolness which demands the highest admiration. What a degree of true human culture, of enthusiasm and strength of character, such a battle implies on the part of men who, as we have seen in the Children's Employment Commission's report, were described as late as 1840, as being thoroughly brutal, and wanting in moral sense. But how hard too must have been the pressure which brought these 40,000 colliers to rise as one man and to fight out the battle like an army not only well disciplined but enthusiastic, an army possessed of one single determination, with the greatest coolness and composure, to a point beyond which further resistance would have been madness. And what a battle! not against visible mortal enemies, but against hunger, want, misery, and homelessness, against their own passions provoked to madness by the brutality of wealth. If they had revolted with violence, they, the unarmed and defenseless, would have been shot down, and a day or two would have decided the victory of the owners. This law-abiding reserve was no fear of the constable's staff, it was the result of deliberation, the best proof of the intelligence and self-control of the working men. Thus were the working men forced once more, in spite of their unexampled endurance, to succumb to the might of capital. But the fight had not been in vain. First of all, this 19-week strike had torn the miners of the north of England forever from the intellectual death in which they had hitherto lain. They have left their sleep, are alert to defend their interests, and have entered the movement of civilization, and especially the movement of the workers. The strike, which first brought to light the whole cruelty of the owners, has established the opposition of the workers here, forever, and made at least two-thirds of them Chartists, and the acquisition of 30,000 such determined, experienced men is certainly of great value to the Chartists. Then too, the endurance and law-abiding which characterized the whole strike, coupled with the active agitation which accompanied it, has fixed public attention upon the miners. On the occasion of the debate upon the export duty on coal, Thomas Duncombe, the only decidedly Chartist member of the House of Commons, brought up the condition of the coal miners, had their petition read, and by his speech forced the bourgeois journals to publish, at least in their reports of parliamentary proceedings, a correct statement of the case. Immediately after the strike, occurred the explosion at Haswell. Roberts went to London, demanded an audience with Peel, insisted as representative of the miners upon a thorough investigation of the case, and succeeded in having the first geological and chemical notabilities of England, Professors Leal and Faraday, commissioned to visit the spot. As several other explosions followed in quick succession, and Roberts again laid the details before the Prime Minister, the latter promised to propose the necessary measures for the protection of the workers, if possible, in the next session of Parliament, i.e., the present one of 1845. All this would not have been accomplished, if these workers had not, by means of the strike, proved themselves freedom-loving men worthy of all respect, and if they had not engaged Roberts as their counsel. Scarcely had it become known that the coal miners of the north had been forced to renounce the Union and discharge Roberts, when the miners of Lancashire formed a union of some 10,000 men, and guaranteed their Attorney General a salary of £1,200 a year. In the autumn of last year they collected more than £700, rather more than £200, of which they expended upon salaries and judicial expenses, and the rest chiefly in support of men out of work, either through want of employment, or through dissensions with their employers. Thus the working men are constantly coming to see more clearly that, united, they too are a respectable power, and can, in the last extremity, defy even the might of the bourgeoisie. And this insight, the gain of all labour movements, has been won for all the miners of England by the Union and the strike of 1844. In a very short time the difference of intelligence and energy which now exists in favour of the factory operatives will have vanished, and the miners of the kingdom will be able to stand abreast of them in every respect. Thus one piece of standing ground after another is undermined beneath the feet of the bourgeoisie, and how long will it be before their whole social and political edifice collapses with the basis upon which it rests? 259. But the bourgeoisie will not take warning. The resistance of the miners does, but embitter it the more. Instead of appreciating this forward step in the general movement of the workers, the property-holding class saw in it only a source of rage against a class of people who are fools enough to declare themselves no longer submissive to the treatment they had hitherto received. It saw in the just demands of the non-possessing workers only impertinent discontent, mad rebellion against divine and human order, and, in the best case, a success to be resisted by the bourgeoisie with all its might, won by ill-intentioned demagogues who live by agitation, and are too lazy to work. It sought, of course, without success, to represent to the workers, that Roberts and the Union's agents, whom the Union very naturally had to pay, were insolent swindlers, who drew the last farthing from the working men's pockets. When such insanity prevails in the property-holding class, when it is so blinded by its momentary profit that it no longer has eyes for the most conspicuous signs of the times, surely all hope of a peaceful solution of the social question for England must be abandoned. The only possible solution is a violent revolution, which cannot fail to take place. The agricultural proletariat. We have seen in the introduction how, simultaneously with the small bourgeoisie and the modest independence of the former workers, the small peasantry also was ruined when the former union of industrial and agricultural work was dissolved, the abandoned fields thrown together into large farms, and the small